Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those. I see we once again have got an international crowd in for this Trinity College London Transformative Teachers webinar. If I could just ask you to type that you can hear me in the chat box, make sure I am audible. Just a yes would be great. Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you as well for being lively in the chat box so far. I can see, again, colleagues from all over the world joining us. Checking my notes here, and I see Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Moldova, Italy, Portugal, Argentina, the UK, Spain. So a really nice mix of peers to be sharing ideas with today. Just before we get started and I introduce today's main speaker, as usual, I'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping here. So as many of you will know, this webinar will last about 1 hour in total. There'll be some time for you within that hour to ask questions as well, time at the end. We are recording this session, so if you have to leave, if you've got to run off to teach a class or prepare for classes, or you've got a mountain of homework that you need to mark and you need to leave, or the internet connection's not great, do try and join us again, of course, but this will be recorded and we'll send a link to this to your email, and it will also be available on the Transformative Teachers webinar website. At the moment, hopefully you can see my screen and see me as well. Do adjust the view to make sure it's the most comfortable for you so you can see the slides and our speaker as well. And we'd like you to interact during this webinar. So you can see that the chat box is nice and lively. Got quite a few people in the room today, so you'll see the chat box is moving very, very quickly, but we love to see your ideas in there. If you do have questions for us or for the speaker, it's best to put those using the question and answer function, then they won't get lost in the chat, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can during or at the end of this webinar today. I think with that, I will just now introduce our speaker. So for those of you that don't know, Shaun Sweeney is a teacher and trainer with over 20 years of ELT experience, and his interests include listening skills, assessment, and task-based learning and teaching. He's worked around the world in various contexts, with longer stretches in Italy, Spain, the UK, and Japan. In 2020, he co-founded Dublin TEFL, which provides tailor-made continuing professional development and consultancy services, and it's one of the validated course providers of the Level 7 Trinity College London DIP TESOL. In addition to that, in October last year, he was awarded the Trinity College London Language Examinations Scholarship. That's a mouthful. And he will be presenting next month at IA TEFL at the annual conference with a presentation on chat GPT and assessment. But that's not what he's talking about today. So welcome, Shaun. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you ever so much, Simon, and thank you very much to Trinity for inviting me. So yes, I am Shaun. Nice to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming. So let me just share my screen and we'll get into the meat of the webinar today. So yeah, assessing listening needs, listening development, second language listening, English, essentially listening for learners is a special area of interest of mine, as is assessment. So it's a perfect, for me, title. I think, assessing listening needs, a perfect topic to speak on. As Simon says, please do add questions in the Q&A box. I'll keep it open and I'll have an eye on it as we go through, but there may be things I don't get to, and I'll certainly come to those at the end. There will be time for questions at the end. So yeah, assessing listening needs, that's the main title. The subtitle was Beyond Correct Answers. So let's begin with that. Why? Why beyond correct answers? Surely correct answers are great. Surely that's what we should be aiming for. Well, let's take a look at this. This is an exchange, a bit of classroom discourse. It is imagined. It comes from John Field's book. You can see the reference at the bottom there. Take a moment, just read through, and in the chat, if you like, Does it look familiar to you, this kind of exchange? Would this be the kind of thing you might do yourself, you might see, you might hear others doing? Does that seem familiar? Let's have a look through. Some familiar names in the chat there. Good to see you as well. So yeah, it looks quite familiar, and certainly it'd be familiar for me. I would have done this sort of thing a lot before I sort of got to a point where I re-examined my practice in terms of listening. And I suppose there it's a bit of a loaded lead up, isn't it? So what's the problem then? If what am I saying? If I re-examine my practice, what's the issue? Excellent. I can already see there's some great ideas in the chat. Ask students to justify. Exactly. This doesn't really tell us a great deal, other than maybe you got the right answer. And even if they did get the right answer, it doesn't tell you how they got there. It's not really telling you anything about the process, any difficulties they're having. You could have two students, they both get the right answer, but they could have arrived there quite differently. One person could have arrived there because their listening skills are very well developed. They're able to catch all of the words. They're able to match those up to words that they know, that they've studied. They're able then to build up a whole discourse structure and extract the meaning, essentially. The other strange, sorry, I'm reading from the chat. The other possibility is that the student could have just guessed the right answer. And you've no idea as a teacher, if we're doing this sort of thing, you've no idea as to how they arrived there. So since the session is looking at assessing listening needs, we need to go beyond just maybe giving a test and having oral answers, as in this example, or even written answers. It's not telling us much about what the learners need, okay? So let's have a look at the learners. Here's four of my learners. I've paraphrased basically what they told me. Do any of these guys seem familiar to you as well? Or maybe which of them? I think we can have a vote maybe. Do you know the same students as me? Do you have students like this? Do they say this kind of thing to you? Okay, you can see maybe for the benefit of the video, I'll read out some of the chats as we go through if there is a recording. So yeah, so there's votes for all of these. Isla for sure. People have passed through the stages themselves. Yeah, me as well, actually. Yeah, in languages that I've learned as well, for sure. I'm even now, Eleanor, I think I am Eleanor, no matter what the language is. But there we go. Yeah, so this resonates a lot. And I've seen there, thanks, Patrick, people like even at C1 level, people still struggling with listening. So it's not something that kind of takes care of itself. So one thing that we can do is speak to our learners and find out what their goals are and what kind of problems they might be having. The framework that I'm going to be using for the session is assessment for learning. Now, you may have quite likely heard of this before, but it's essentially looking at how we can find out where people are, where they need to be, and how to get there, kind of a journey. But it's a cyclical thing as well, hence the sort of arrows going around here. You might start setting a goal, or maybe that goal's been given to you, and then you might think, okay, what problems do my learners have? And what can I do? You know, what can I do as a teacher, or what can I recommend they do as learners in order to overcome these issues? And you do the same thing for vocabulary. You do the same thing for grammar, for all skills. But we're looking at listening here. Okay, I'm going to take you through this cycle and show you one example from an intermediate class. Okay, this is one where the goal setting has happened before the class, and all of the techniques and so on are going to be happening in the classroom. That's not to say that this cannot also happen outside of the classroom. You can set your own goals. Let's say you're learning a language and you have goals that you want to reach in terms of your listening, much as you would for reading or speaking or whatever. You've got your own goals. You can do that outside the classroom. You can also find out yourself if you're equipped, and maybe it's something that, you know, if you've got a good teacher, they can show you how, and they can model it in the classroom. How can I find out what problems I'm having? And then those follow-up techniques, again, this is stuff that as teachers, I work in the classroom myself, I work with teachers in the classroom all the time. These are things we can do in the classroom, but we're also modeling like, okay, well, some of the things we did today, you would say to your students, some of the things we did today, can you do that at home? Can you do some of this at home? To try and also take it outside of the classroom. So I just wanted to say that I'm going to take you through this cycle with an example. All of the examples happen to be in the classroom, but that's not to say that this isn't something that can't happen also outside of the class as well. Okay. All right, let's take a look. Goal setting then is that first stage. Okay. Having just said, though, it is a cycle, you know, you find some more problems, you come back and you revise those goals, but goal setting is the first stage. Where do we start? You know, what can we do to find out goals for listening? Here's 3 areas. Now, there could be some more as well, but I'm trying to think about different contexts that we all work in, okay? You might have a lot of control over your course, or you might have no control over it. You might have complete control over the exam that your students do, or you might have no control over it. It'll depend, okay? And I can see people from all different areas, different parts of the world, and I know myself that I've worked in different places where I've had quite varying levels of control over these different factors. So you can start by looking at these 3 things. Maybe there's an exam. There's very often an exam. Are your students studying for an exam? Quick yes or no in the chat. Type that in there. Any of your students doing an exam? Straight in with some yeses. So yeah, it's not a big surprise. And some of them there. Thanks, Hilary. Oh, hi, Janet. Okay. So yeah, so there's a fair few. Now, they'll at some point in your students' lives, you know, if they're in school, there's going to be a summative assessment. They'll have an end of year test. It might not be a proficiency test, an external body, say like Trinity. Other exam boards are available. It might not be an external proficiency test, but there's very often summative assessments. Students get grades. They'll ask you as well for various things. Now, is this in the test? You know, do I need to be paying attention really, or can I slack off a bit today? So one thing you can do is look at that exam and think, what is it testing? Obviously, it's going to be testing a variety of text types. So it could be maybe being better able to listen to monologues, dialogues, conversation, announcements, those kinds of things. You can look in the course book, or maybe you have a scheme of work where you're working. Maybe that, again, is something that you've chosen, or it's something that's been given to you. You can have a look through, like, what kind of listenings are important? You know, if a key goal of this course and something that all my stakeholders, you know, my boss, the parents, the HR department, whoever it is, they're like, well, you've got to do this book, and that's fixed. Then you're going to have a look in the book and see what you can do to build success in dealing with the kind of listening that's in there. Or perhaps it's something that's more flexible. You can bring in your own materials, you know, and you can adapt that scheme of work. And then, of course, you can ask the learners, you know, what are your goals? What do you want to do with listening? And that's a great thing to do. We should definitely be asking our learners. All of this can have an input into the goals, but you'll notice with the arrows, or maybe you've noticed, I don't know, I've just put them on the edge. They're kind of on the outer circle here, because generally what you'll find is something very broad brush, something very general. You'll have things like text types. You'll have kind of the product, like I'll have to be able to understand this. I'll have to be able to understand it in detail, or I'll have to be able to understand the main points, but it won't really tell you much about the process. And for that, you have to do a little bit more diagnosis. Okay, so that is the next stage in our assessment for learning. You've got some broad goals, like, okay, well, clearly they want to be able to understand in English. And these kinds of texts are the things that come up in their life, or in their course materials, the courseware, or in exams that they may or may not be studying for. Okay, so we want to try and get a little closer to that center. It's like, what exactly is it? Another thing we can draw on when we're thinking about goal setting is the research. It's like, what are the problems? What are the key problems that learners have? So the vast majority, as you'll see here, the vast majority of learner problems, at least up to B2 level, at least, and I saw in the chat earlier on, you know, some people saying at C1, people are still having problems with listening. But the main issue is low-level decoding. What do we mean by that? hey, if you're up to speed, type it in the chat. Let's have a competition. Best definition of low-level decoding. Pop that in the chat. And if you agree or not, I don't know. See if you agree there. But this is from John Field, who's a leading figure in listening research for assessment and for listening development. And this is from an interview, but basically sums up a vast array of research. Low-level decoding. Thanks very much. Oh, it's coming in. Patrick, thank you. He's in there first prize there. And yeah, we've got audio signal into understandable speech. Hi there. Matthew Bishop, very good. What else do we have? The phrases and the order hearing them in the order which the speaker intends. I suppose intention in terms of the meaning they're trying to convey. Good. So essentially, you've got the sounds that are coming into your ears as a listener. You have to be able to like catch those, divide them up into words, match them to words that you know. So decoding is that. It's matching the sound signal, the actual acoustic signal, and matching it to phonemes, syllables, and words, essentially. Okay, so, oh yeah, I know that word. Let's go back to some of our learners here. Let's take Isla, for example. She likes to watch TV series, but she always needs the subtitles. That's so common. That's certainly common for me in Spanish, for example, which I learn as well. Always needing that, but when you see it, it's like, well, I know these words. It's not actually a big problem. Okay, obviously vocabulary development is important and will be a barrier up to certain levels, but a lot of the time you'll have somebody who has a good vocabulary and they'll see the transcript or subtitles or whatever, and then kind of almost like a facepalm moment, and it can be quite demotivating. It's like, why? I know these words, why am I not understanding? And that is a decoding problem. Okay. Let's take Alberto, a similar thing. Perhaps he's been very well trained, and kudos to his teacher for that. He's passed his exam. He's been very well trained, perhaps in test-wise strategies, things like reading through the questions, trying to predict what the answer might be, and so on. And he's got really good at taking tests, but perhaps not fully developing his listening skills, including being able to understand fast speech. He's on a study trip. He's out and about, maybe, I don't know, listening to people on the bus or interacting in a cafe. There's lots of background noise. He's unable to quickly, automatically do that decoding, match that string of sound, those strings of words, divide them up and match them to what he knows in his head. So very frustrating. And the phone obviously is terrible because of the complete lack of ability to see anybody. You're really, really, really relying on just an acoustic signal. Giovanni, very common as well, the score staying the same. The thing with Giovanni, I think, there's a nice metaphor about sports, isn't there? I heard someone talking about marathons, or I believe they were using marathons as an analogy. It's like, if you want to win marathons, the best way to do it isn't run a marathon every day. In fact, that's a really bad thing to do, and it'll be very demotivating, and you'll never want to run marathons. But the idea is, you can't just get better at something by doing that same thing again and again and again. You've got to work on specific skills, training certain things there. Okay, I'm going to have a quick scroll down the chat. And quite right. Hi, Neil. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, what we're talking about is a bottom-up process. Okay, parallel processing and listening. You have top-down and bottom-up. Top-down, you're using all of the stuff that you bring, your knowledge of the world, context and everything, the contextual, schematic stuff, that's top-down. And bottom-up is the signal. So it's the words and the sounds of those words when we're talking about listening. These happen at the same time. You can't really pull them apart, but a lot of material focuses a lot on top-down. Because it's quite easy to focus on, start predicting things, looking at a picture, talking to each other about what you know about it. And there's not a lot of focus on bottom up. So maybe we can have a look now at how we might be able to focus on that. And as I say, diagnose learner issues. So that's the goal setting. You're going to have in there, one of my goals in the back of my mind is I want them to get better at this decoding. Okay, I'm going to then balance that with the text types in the exam, balance it with whatever my scheme of work says, and so on. Here are some concrete techniques then. This is a nice one. I think it's very simple. You could call it hands up or timestamp. You're playing a recording and learners put their hands up when they don't understand something. Very simple. Okay, and that gets you to notice what areas of the recording, if it is a recording, or you could be live, it could be your voice, it gets you to notice, hang on, there's a problem here. what is the problem? You know, let's examine it, let's slow it down. Or timestamp, you've got something recorded, it's playing, and you can see the time counter, the clock. Get the learners to write down, okay, no, at 45 seconds, I really didn't understand. What did he say? Couldn't get it. What did she say there? And write down just the time. They can then compare with each other, and you come back together and say, okay, let's take a look. Okay. All right. Here's an example. All right. This is from Florence Patty. If you're watching, Florence, thank you very much for letting me share this. I double checked just today. I was very pleased that she let me share this. So this is, we work with groups of teachers everywhere. This happens to be in Vietnam. And we have a high school class of kids, and they're going to a private language school after their regular school. So they're often exhausted, a mixed motivation levels, shall we say. But they aren't quite motivated by exams. Now they're studying for the IELTS. In that exam, there's nothing particularly related to this lesson in the listening exam. And that might sometimes cause a bit of a mismatch with motivation. I say, why are we doing this, Shaun? This isn't in the exam. This is kind of odd. So one way around that is to look at, okay, well, how about speaking? And that's what Flossie did here. Let's take a look. So I'm going to show you some of the material, and you'll listen to it as well. You might recognize this. I don't know if anyone teaches IELTS, has taken IELTS, or it's similar to other exams that use a monologue, which has its issues, but we won't get into that now. Here there's a monologue there where it's like a couple of minutes, prepare, and then talk about something. Okay, and then the examiner will listen and maybe ask some follow-up questions. This one here was like, talk about an animal that's important to you. I think this came from a genuine speaking task. And what Flossie did was she recorded it herself. She said, okay, I'm going to record this. The person my students listen to most that's not exam or course book material is me. And I wonder, and this was a question that has arisen through sort of a little exploration of teaching practice. It was like, do you think the students understand everything you say? Because there's an assumption there, and often actually maybe that they understand less than you might think. You think, well, they're sort of nodding along and they're getting through tasks and so on, but it's like, I don't think they do understand absolutely everything, which isn't a bad thing, because you can then use that as a model to try and develop your learners' listening skills. And that's what she decided to do. So she recorded this herself. I'll play you a little extract, okay, just so you get a flavor for it. And the question I'd like you to consider, I'm pointing at my screen, I'll use the cursor instead, is this one. Does this task diagnose any problems? So that's a simple yes or no, just while I bring the audio up. Here we go.
It's impossible to overstate how important my dog is to me. His name is Copper. He's 6 years old, and he's a beagle, so he's got quite the howl. We got him as a puppy in the United States when he was just 8 weeks old, and he went with us to Malaysia and now to Vietnam, so he's traveled the world with us. He's got quite the personality, and you know how people say that pets take on the characteristics of their owners? Well, it's totally true in this case, and which is kind of funny. When we observe it. He loves to cuddle. That's probably the thing I love the most about him, when he lays at my feet and we cuddle together. He makes my life better in a million different ways, but it's also a lot of work. But that also makes my life better. That when I have to take him for walks, it makes me more active. And just having something or someone to love consistently who gives back that love, I think is really important for us humans. Our connections to animals, I think, are one of our better qualities. And so, yeah, I can't imagine my life without him.
Okay, there we go. Sounds lovely. What do we think about Copper? Sounds like a nice dog. Have you got a nice visual of Copper in your mind? Did that paint a good picture for you? Okay, so that's the content. What about the technical side, shall we say? Does this task diagnose any problems? Listening to Flossie talking about her dog. I'm having a look in the chat there. That's a good question, Neil. I'll come back to that about the hands up. Well, let's make it a rhetorical question. Not exactly. Thanks, Clara. Not really, not yet, at least. It's a good start, but not quite yet. At the moment, what they're doing is just processing for meaning, overall meaning. Okay, it's like, so they can say, okay, who's this animal? Oh, right, it's Copper, the dog. What's her connection with him? Why is Copper important? That's great. It's a nice bit of authentic material. Okay, and she recorded this, by the way. She could, of course, have done it live. She's their teacher, but she chose to record it just so that she could be really precise with pausing, which is what we're going to see next. How to diagnose the problems then? First of all, they would process for overall meaning, listen for global understanding, a bit more than gist if you're thinking like, okay, it's going to be a gist listening. And then you can ask, and again, this is recommended from field, how much did you understand? Why is that a good question to ask? And this is, again, part of that sort of goal setting cycle, us goal setting and noticing problems yourself. You're encouraging reflection in the learners. And it's okay that it's quite low. Now, I've had classes where the first time you do this, they might sort of say, yeah, no, 100. And then it sort of comes down when they realize, oh, actually, there's a fair bit I've lost. On the other hand, I've had classes where they go in quite low and say that's 50 or 60. And coming back to a question that was in the chat there about hands up, could that be demotivating because it's a deficit model? Yeah, it could be, if that's where the lesson ends. But the important point here is to share with everyone, like, look, this is hard. This isn't easy. And there's no pretending that it is easy. It's like, this is hard. I find it hard. You find it hard. She finds it hard. They find it hard. Everyone's going to find it hard. But don't worry, that's normal. And what we're going to do in the lesson today is help you a bit with that. There's no real, apart from really grading the text, there's no getting around the fact that unscripted listening is difficult. And sharing that actually can boost motivation because you don't feel alone. And as long as there is this continual cycle of like, okay, there's the problem, now we're going to work on it. And at the end of the lesson, we say, okay, have we got a little bit better? Do we think we can take that outside the classroom? Okay, see you next time, and we'll continue. As long as that cycle continues, I don't think it should be demotivating. Okay, I mean, motivation is such a complex, multifaceted thing. Anyway, there will be times, I'm not saying my classes are full of 100% motivated students all the time. They are normal, shall we say? But yeah, how public should it be? In some classes, I've had, students write down, okay, they write down their number, and it's like, okay, that's for you. That's fine. Just put it on a piece of paper. I'll come around and I'll have a look and say, okay, that's interesting. Put that away. In other classes, I'll get them to share it. So it'll be down to you as a teacher as well as to how open your students will be to doing that sort of thing, and whether it's something you do the first time or say, well, I'm going to save that. I'll keep it personal to them today. And maybe as we go through the course, we'll say, listen, by the way, if you put 30, you're not alone. A lot of other people in the room also put that. So it's about, making it visible and being honest and saying, this is hard, but we can help you. And the whole cycle of setting your own goals and knowing where you are and knowing where you have to get to is, of course, a whole set of skills, your metacognitive skills, which research, once again, quite robustly shows is a big indicator. If you have these developed metacognitive skills, it's a big indicator of listening performance as well as other language skills as well. So that's a start. Okay, it's just about saying, okay, where am I? And I put goal setting with a question mark because another thing you might say is, okay, if you've got 80, do you want 100 or are you okay? Because that's another thing. It might be like, well, listen, I've got the main point, Shaun. I'm quite happy with that. That's fine. I don't really need, let's do some grammar or let's learn some words or something. And it's like, okay, you can involve them in that process as well. It's like, ask them, do you want to get above where you are or not? Giving a little bit of responsibility for that goal setting or commitment as well. So what did she do? This is the timestamp technique. She played that recording. She played it once and they said, okay, great. You got a dog called Copper. He sounds lovely. They asked her some questions about him. And then she said, okay, now listen again and just she did it slightly differently. She didn't. You could quite simply have them write down the number, but she gave them a blank piece of paper like this. Yes, there it is. Her recording was 1 minute 5, so it was 65 seconds for the mathematicians. And as she played it through, they just had to put a cross or a circle or something to say like, oh, there's a problem. Like, what? I didn't get that word. I didn't understand what she said. That made it visual for her, the teacher, so she could see like, okay, there's a problem in this specific part. She had actually decided in advance as well, like these 4 chunks, for example, they're going to be a problem, and that's going to be my lesson focus. But there's flexibility here. It allows for also other things. It's like, oh, actually, I didn't think of that. Now, 48 seconds, everyone's having a problem. What's going on? Let's have a look together at that particular part. And this is slightly blurred, but you've heard the recording. So at the top we've got, it's impossible to overstate how important my dog is to me. And she's highlighted certain parts. These are the pre-decided areas of focus, and it's phonological focus. Now, when we go back to that idea of decoding, the problem of decoding, it's about phonology. It's about matching the sound to the words that you know. And then when you have connected speech changes and radical changes in unscripted speech that go beyond sort of the linking and so on that might be taught in courseware. So here we have, you're asking the class and you're homing in on problems. These ones that are coloured, these are the pre-decided ones, but there may be more. And as a teacher, it would be judgment to say, actually, let's look at that. Let's look at what you guys are saying, either as well, or maybe instead of. Maybe they didn't circle the same as the teacher has. And in fact, that was the next question, I think, if we put it up here. And just a moment. Okay. Okay. So at that stage, sorry, we're in the stage where the problem has been highlighted. Okay, learners have struggled to decode Flossie, talking about Coffer, talking about her dog. And then where does the teacher go next in terms of lesson planning and in terms of decisions in the classroom? Well, there's some possibilities, and I'll show you what Flossie did, and I'll talk about a couple of other possibilities, okay? One possibility is raise awareness of possible sound shapes. So certain things that were underlined, certain things that were difficult, they can sound very different if you're speaking carefully, if you're doing a presentation, if you're talking to a friend, if the topic is familiar, if the listener is familiar, it can have a massive impact on how careful your speech is. And it could be very careful, and in which case it's quite easy to separate and to decode, or it could be less careful, you know, an unscripted natural speech model. One thing you can do in the classroom is explicitly teach that as well and say, okay, what happens? What always happens with these words? Essentially, what very often happens with these words together? And that's what Flossie did. So let's take a look. They have their handout with the numbers, and then she's projected on the board. Okay, so it's like, okay, it's at second 45. Did you circle the same as me? And she was quite right. She predicted quite accurately areas that they had difficulty with. So, for example, that first one, you might be able to, here it says number 9, it's got so he's got. But Flossie didn't say so he's got. In the recording, she said so's got, and it's very, very reduced. There's a lot of connection there, and that's why it was a problem for the learners when they were listening. Well, we'll have a look at the different colors. What do they represent? She's divided it up into 3 areas. Let's have a look. First of all, green. So what do the words green have in common? Answers in the chat, actually. They're not on the screen, are they? So if you like, let's join in. Totally and probably. What do these words have in common? Very good. Thanks very much, Claire. So they're adverbs. And what about, okay, phonologically, what do these words have in common? I'm going to go for, thanks, Matthew, both end in ly, and I'm going to go for its adverbs. And Judy, yeah, losing a syllable. It's extremely common totally, probably, possibly. Think of some more in your head now. But in rapid speech, they very often get reduced. They might lose a whole syllable. There could be, thanks Neil, vowel reduction. There could be, I mean, think about the variety of ways you can say totally. It could be totally, totally, totally. Same with probably, 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 probably. In rapid speech, and you might not even notice it, even as a teacher, okay, until you start analyzing. Probably is very often just probably. That's probably not a very good idea. We should probably move on. It doesn't have to sound like that, but it can sound like that, and it can very often sound like that. And that's something that if you raise awareness in our students, they'll be able to get on with authentic speech a lot better. So as you can see, this is explicitly looking at that. We're losing a sound. Elision, if you like, radical reductions, streamlining, and it's very common with adverbs. The words in yellow, what do they have in common? And we've got, well, all of them have got, and they're all next to a pronoun. That's all. And again, they could be radically reduced. There's a lot of connection. We got him, he's got, so he's got, okay. And looking at those sounds, they appear a lot in that transcript, and giving learners practice to hear them again and again is useful at building up a memory trace. Similarly with the words in purple. So here the answer is they all have when plus a pronoun. And there's a lot of either dropping of the aspirant there in he, and you've got when he was. There's a lot of weak sounds. There's a lot of catenation, linking, liaison, whatever you want to call it. These sounds are all squashed together. And in the chat, exactly, we've got contractions, dropped sounds, losing a syllable, exactly. So that was a focus. And perhaps the learners themselves added some extra focus, you know, maybe they'd circled something else, but this was the pre-decided focus in Flossie's lesson. Okay. Okay, what next? What happened next? There was some drilling. So listen and repeat. Drilling doesn't have to be listen and repeat. It could also be receptive drilling. So maybe silent drilling, just say it in your head, repeat it again and again. Something Mark Hancock's called the earworm effect, where you sort of repeat, or micro loop or broken record or that kind of thing, where you can say again when he was, repeating and repeating and repeating. If you look at the top slide here, we've got a botanical walk. This is taken from Richard Cordwell's work, where he's looking at 3 different modes, if you like. The greenhouse, everything nice and separate and divided. That could be the citation form. So when he was. The garden, where things are, you know, still quite ordered, but moving, you know, blending into each other. And that's what Richard Cordwell would call the sort of words politely shaking hands, or the rules of connected speech. So when he was, when he, and the jungle, where things can get completely lost, like we gone, instead of we got him, but we gone. So showing again the possibilities, not saying like you have to sound like this, and that's important as well. This is all about receptive stuff. It's all about listening, but it's like you can hear this. It's possible. It's very common, and don't be afraid. Okay, it's something that we can study in the classroom. Youglish is a lovely site, and this is again something you can take outside the classroom. Type in a certain word, and even better, a chunk. For example, here we've got when we were or when he was. Click say it, and you hear multiple examples. So you can hear lots of different people saying it, not just a teacher or not just a speaker who was on the original recording. Lots of different people saying it, and you can decide yourself. That's the task she's given here. Is that greenhouse? Is it jungle? You know. The answer itself isn't particularly important. What's important is raising awareness of the fact that these can sound very different in different contexts, and a lot of the time they can sound super reduced. Play phrase me, thanks. Yeah, Madhya, I like that one as well. There's an alternative that's just been mentioned in the chat. So you've got Youglish. Go and have a look at that. And there's one in the chat as well. Play phrase me, .me, me is a good one too. Okay, so that was Flossie's lesson. What other techniques can we do? Well, pause transcription is a nice one as well. This is used a lot in research into decoding, but you can use it in the classroom. It's very simple. You're playing the recording and you pause it. and the learners have to transcribe. I don't mean like use your phonemic chart or anything. I just mean write down the words. They have to write down the last few words. You don't have to give it a particular number, but it'll be about 5 maybe. The last few words they heard. So you get to a point that you think might be difficult, and you just press stop and say, okay, write down. It's almost like a dictation activity, but just a few words, the last few words. And this is an activity that will kind of strengthen their phonological loop, if you like. They'll be able to hold more in their auditory memory, but it also reveals something like, is what they're holding in their memory, does that match any words or not? So you get them to write it down. They can compare with partners. Again, it's making what's internal visible to you, the teacher, so you can take a look as well. You can do that on pen and paper. You can do it on a shared doc with computers so that it's easy to see lots of different people at once. It's a handy technique. Okay. Another technique, similar, would be to, once you've done the listening for global understanding, once you've even built up some meaning, some of the details, it's like, okay, now listen again, and here's a transcript, and the learners themselves, it's like circle anything that sounds unusual or difficult, and by which I mean, what didn't you understand first time round? Which of those moments where you're going, oh, I know that word, why didn't I catch that the first time round? And get them to circle or underline or what have you, that identify that. Once you've done that, the important next stage is why. It's like, why didn't you get that? So why didn't you understand that? And the answer is probably phonological. Once again, it's going to be something to do with it being maybe an unfamiliar variety, maybe, but highly likely there'll be some sort of reduction. Maybe there's elision, some sounds missing. Maybe there's assimilation, sounds joining together and creating a new unexpected sound. Quick, easy, fairly low prep. Okay, just go to the transcript, play it again. Listening again with a transcript is something you can use diagnostically. It's also something to do once you've done some close work on listening. You could even come back and say, now listen again, and you're building fluency. It's something they've already listened to. You're building the fluency in their listening, and hopefully confidence and building motivation if they start off quite demotivated. What else have we got? Oh, this is a different example. It's just a different example transcript. Okay, so we've seen Flossie's where she did the teacher talk about copper. This is a higher level one. This happened to be about, what was this about? 3D printing, this one. And you can notice the bits that are highlighted. It's just work layer by layer, which in the original audio is something like layer by layer, just work layer by layer. And it impossible to understand, essentially. At first. Then if it's sort of picked out and said, well, okay, this sometimes happens, and let's look at some other words with by in the middle, layer by layer, side by side, and so on, then you can build confidence and ability to decode it again in the future. Some techniques can be either diagnosis or a follow-up. All right, now what about micro dictation? Dictation in general is a great idea. And it can be used at any level. That's what's so good about it. I think even from elementary, and I use a lot of dictation at elementary, micro dictation. I'm not giving them a whole text. I might just dictate a question. Instead of putting a question on the board, start by dictating it to the class and see if they can get it, then put it on the board. Just little and often is a way of diagnosing the problem. It's like, yeah, you're having a problem with this. And it could be a follow-up technique. Let's do, okay, this is from an elementary class. I had a group from Panama and they were elementary, some of them beginners actually, and they did a 4-week course. And I dictated some stuff. Let's try, okay? I'm gonna do a couple of these for you. Let me see now. Can I have, I've forgotten what's behind these animations. Right, I'm describing a fruit. Okay, and bear in mind, my learners are from Panama. That might help you. So I'm going to give you a few clues, and you have to tell me what the fruit is. I'll be very surprised and impressed if you guess the fruit. Okay, number 1, listen and write. You can just type in the chat. If you'd like to join in, type in the chat what I say. Number 1, it's rough on the outside. It's rough on the outside. Nice one, Julie. Excellent. Lovely. And you've gone straight for Patrick's gone straight for kiwi. It's not a kiwi. But yeah, there we go. So I just dictated and the learners had to write this down. Incidentally, this was all stuff they'd already told me. Remember, it's an elementary class. They'd already described this fruit. They had described to me. We'd already worked on the vocab. I know they have studied this vocabulary. It might be a stretch to say I know they know it, but I know that we've studied it and we've talked about it and we've talked about fruits. So this is a later lesson where it's looking very much at the listening, okay, at elementary level. His flesh is sweet, number 2, sorry. His flesh is sweet. His flesh is sweet. His flesh is sweet. And we've got pineapple, no. Plátano, no. Dragon fruit, no. And thanks very much for having a go there. Its flesh is sweet. Its flesh is. You'll notice what's going on, right? So they're also, when you're revealing this, they go, you know, and probably quite irritated with me, the teacher, feel like they've been tricked. And it's like, okay, it's sometimes sounds like is. So there we go. All right, number 3. It has its own flavor. It has its own flavor. I'm going to whip through these because time is running out. Then we've got snot like a mango. I think that's my favorite, number 4. Snot like a mango. Snot like a mango. I think mango came up. It looks a little bit like a papaya. A little bit. And it has more fiber. So just 6, it could be 5, it could be 4 sentences which were dictated to the class. And what is the fruit? It's not, no one's got it. It's called mamey, M-A-M-E-Y. I've never heard of it. And unless it snuck in the chat there, nor have you. There we go. Check it out. It looks nice. It's really interesting. So anyway, that shows you elementary. All right, it's fine. Okay, we've got audios from podcasts and authentic listenings and so on. But you can do this sort of thing very simply at any level, and especially with teacher voice, very low resources, just by using micro dictation. Okay. That could have been diagnostic. It could have been follow-up. It totally depends on where you are with your class. Okay. Now, something else to make it communicative is once you've studied certain areas, maybe get the students to do it. This one comes from an intermediate class. It's a pair dictation. So here, all kinds of, I think was one of the chunks they'd say. So all kinds of. That had been studied, and then they had to write a sentence about it. This is about making friends, I think. It'll just be impossible. One of my favorite things. Students wrote their own sentences using little sentence stems, dictated it to their partners. So there's an extra chance. Here you've got production, which I know we're looking at listening, but a lot of research suggests that proprioception, in inverted commas, can lead to better ability to perceive. That's Adrian Underhill with the term proprioception there. Say it to hear it is a simpler way of putting that. Again, Mark Hancock, I think, that's his phrase. Here we've got a couple of examples from the board. Pair dictation, they have to listen, write down what they heard. And if you design it nicely, you can make them do opinions or questions. So it could lead to a communicative task when they're thoroughly had enough of looking at listening. It's like, okay, let's do a bit of speaking based on that as well. Okay. Discrimination tasks are also good, and Mark Hancock again is a good one to look at here. Have a look at his article in ETP, Fun with Phrasal Homophones. Have a look at any of his stuff on Prompack. It's there's some great stuff in here. And here's one example of his. Do you hear A, packs and bags, or do you hear B, packs and bags? The point being, a lot of the time it might be identical, not nearly the same, but identical in terms of the auditory signal. Okay, the only thing that helps us is the context. Okay, so there we have it. We've seen a couple of examples then of that cycle from goal setting through to problem diagnosis and follow-up techniques. Those last 2, there could be certainly a bit of a blur there. Some techniques that you would use as a follow-up, you can equally use as a way of diagnosing issues, and that will feed in to goal setting that maybe you're in charge of as the teacher, or maybe you're developing, a relationship with your learners where you're handing over a lot more to them. They need to start setting the goals. They need to then diagnose their own problems. You model how to do that in the classroom. You show them some techniques that they can also use outside of the classroom. And so it goes on. So thank you very much for listening. Ran slightly over the 45, but just, we've got a good 10, 11 minutes there for Q&A.
No, that's great, Shaun. Thank you so much for sharing all those ideas. I've just before we get into a couple of people's questions I've noted down here, I think, and I should say thank you to everyone for being so active in the chat box as well. There's been some really nice extra comments on things that you've been saying, and also some really nice suggestions of adapting some of those ideas that you were suggesting there. So, adjusting them for different contexts. So, I really like the idea of moving from micro dictation and then pair dictation, that kind of thing. So very practical, but also really nice to see that this is connected to research as well, and this is something that we're bringing and seeing more and more of in classrooms, that we can actually see where the research connects to what we're doing with our students in the classroom to help them. So thank you for bringing all of those things together. I suppose we should also say thanks to Flossie, I think you said as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Flossie. Definitely.
For all of that. One question that did come up here, which was I thought quite interesting, was you were talking about using the teacher's voice and finding things on tools like Youglish. A couple of people mentioned ELF, English as a lingua franca or world Englishes. How does this fit in with this kind of the listening activities that you were describing here?
Absolutely, a very good point. Now, most of my learners as well need English for international purposes. There's two things to say here. One is that a lot of these features are present in ELF. It's not just something that's a preserve of native speakers. They might not be present to the same degree or in the same way, but changes in rapid unscripted speech do happen. And that's something that Richard Caldwell has pointed out before in the past. Another aspect to think about is global media. So a lot of the time we encourage our learners to consume global media in English, and a lot of the time that is through things like, let's say, YouTube, Netflix, shorter videos on TikTok and so on, where they will find fast unscripted speech. We should adjust, of course, to whatever our learners' needs are. I mentioned three things at the beginning with goal setting. One would be final exams. The other one would be the learners themselves, and then it would be the scheme of work. Now, if we start with the learners themselves, if they are just using English and their goals are to use English with other speakers of English as an international language, as ELF, that should definitely be our focus. And what we should do, in fact, is look at features of, I don't know, let's say I've got a group of learners who, business purposes, and they are doing a deal with a Korean company, and it's important, and they've got to go and make some money. My job is maybe to get them more comfortable with hearing Korean English, and getting them to analyze that and seeing that, and that would be the focus. The point, I suppose, is one of the key issues with listening is phonology. And that's true whether or not they're listening to, say, Flossie from the States, or whether they're listening to Una from Seoul. We should be looking at what those phonological features are that are causing a barrier, which are nothing to do with vocabulary or grammar, which very often are secondary.
That comes right back to what you were saying at the beginning, sort of looking at the context that the students you're working with, the learners you're working with, what they want to do with their English, who they need to be able to understand. And that helps us develop the materials and tools to help them better understand where they're going to be.
Absolutely.
Love that. Thank you. Speaking of context, obviously you talked at the beginning and a couple of times throughout this, moving from kind of exam contexts through to real world listening in this, but we do have a question here that's about exam listening. How do the ideas that you've just gone through here, how do they help develop the skills needed for exams? Do you see the link there?
I do. One of your jobs as somebody who prepares learners for exams is to make sure they get better scores. And as I said earlier on, you can do that sometimes without actually developing the skill the exam wants to test. And it's your duty to point that out to the students, and the students will want to know it. And it's like, here's some test day strategies. And let's go back to that sports analogy. It's like match day strategies. Even, if they have good, solid automatic decoding skills, they'll get a higher score. That will take maybe longer to develop than maybe a tactic that you can teach them, like, right, this exam's like this, so what you have to do for this exam is X, Y, and Z. It's important to prepare students for exams. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it's not always the same thing. And I think maybe, that sports metaphor is quite good. I mentioned marathons, but it could equally be, I don't know, pick your favorite sport, football. I don't know if that is, but it's a common one. And it's like, you don't just play matches all the time. You'll be doing other things. And you don't just talk about tactics for winning the match. You do other bits of training that the football might not even be there. You'll be doing exercises and all sorts of other things. So I think building up solid aiming for automatic fast decoding, while building, of course, grammar, vocabulary, and so on. You can't particularly separate those things, but building that thing up for listening is important, no matter what the final goal. And it'll be important for a test as well. It'll get you higher tests. It'll get you higher test scores.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's nice to see that link as well. Yes, I mean, ultimately, a person's goal might be to get the exam, but probably that's a gateway to something else, as you're saying, right? So then they're going to be perhaps surrounded by English in a different way or using it in a different way. So yes, exactly. Making those links, even though, okay, we're focusing on the exam at the moment, you're going to need these listening skills in life generally, and hopefully to enjoy just English, something that's in the English language in general, like you mentioned, Netflix and podcasts and things like that. So
absolutely, yeah,
excellent. There's a question here that I found quite interesting. That's about like some of these things that you've asked, you have asked the learners to do, and Flossie asked learners to do. They seem quite demanding in some ways. The listeners are kind of the learners are listening, but they're also doing their timestamps and writing things down. Do you find that this takes a little bit of learner training, and how do you kind of introduce these ideas?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if it's the first time you do anything new, you'll have issues, so it's something. I mean, don't be surprised if that happens. I'd say that's true not just for the stuff with listening we're talking about. Anytime you do a new task with your learners, it might not go, even if it's a good task, it might not go as well as you expect the first time. Stick at it a couple of times before you make a decision on whether it is good for your learners or not. With that issue of like writing down times, or even like putting your hand up, you don't have to write it down. You could, as I say, it could be as simple as putting your hand up. That's not that taxing. You've already listened once. You've already established global meaning. You've done that also with the help of your teacher. Then to just play and say, right, okay, now this time, I really want you to just listen to the words. If there's a bit where you feel, tell me. And how can you tell me? You can raise your hand. You can, I don't know, hold up the red, I don't know, lollipop stick, or write down the number. If there's a big clock on the board, it's right, okay, I'll write that down. Find out what works for your students, but it's a way of them letting you know, and being able to remember. If you've got a long, 1 minute might not seem long, but it is quite long. It's a way of remembering, okay, what bits then, where was the problem, in a way that isn't reliant, say, on use of comprehension questions, which may actually be looking for testing distractors or isolating a certain lexical item or whatever the question has been designed for. Yeah, in short, it might be difficult. Keep training your learners, but I find it's not as difficult as it might first seem, because you have already done a fair bit of listening.
Excellent. So just to make that clear as well, I've got a good question here. So before you go into this kind of detailed and decoding, breaking down, you would recommend a kind of gist listening exercise of some sort, so people have got used to the accent, the kind of the topic.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah. As a rule of thumb, you can experiment with these things for sure. I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive, of course, but I'd say, yeah, as a rule of thumb, establish general meaning. Definitely get them to tune in. It'll take a good 10 seconds to tune into a new speaker, especially if it's an unfamiliar accent, for example. But even if it's not, it takes a bit of time to tune into somebody before you start extracting meaning. So yeah, I would recommend doing that before. In general, before getting down to the nitty-gritty we've looked at.
Excellent. Well, I think with the words nitty-gritty, I think this is about time to call everything for today. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much again, Shaun, for sharing your ideas. Some really good stuff for all of us to take back to our classrooms and to our teachers' rooms as well, to discuss and to, as you say, iteratively experiment with as we go along. So thank you very much for sharing all of those ideas. And thank you very much to everyone that has joined us today. We look forward to seeing you all next time for the Trinity College London Transformative Teachers webinar. Details are up on the website as usual. And for those that are going to IATEFL, Shaun, we might bump into you there as well. We might have more questions about this, so be prepared to be mobbed. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your mornings, afternoons, and evenings. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.